Welcome to episode 16 of the Give Us Time podcast, the podcast that highlights the extraordinary members of our armed forces and their families. This episode, we have a fantastic guest. He served in the Black Watch, and during his 10 years in the army, he served in Kosovo and Iraq. On leaving the army, he requalified as a doctor and continues serving as a doctor to this day during the ongoing coronavirus pandemic. So we are honored to welcome former Lieutenant Colonel Nick Ord to the podcast. Nick, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. I'm delighted.
And joining us, as always, is Give Us Time Managing Director Rupert Forrest. So, Rupert, thank you so much for joining us as well.
A pleasure once more, yeah.
And Nick, do you mind just quickly going and telling us, Nick, about where you went and grew up, what it was like for you as a kid?
So I was what I now describe as an international vagabond. So my father was in the armed forces. So we moved around the world every couple of years. So I was born up in Inverness, but we then moved shortly after that to Outpour for a couple of years, back to southern England, spent a good few years in Western Germany during the sort of time of towards the end of the Cold War, then back to England for a bit, lived in Saudi Arabia for a couple of years, lived in America briefly. So a sort of international lifestyle, moving around as a family with my father's work in the army.
Oh, wow, brilliant. So what kind of impact did that have on you then as a kid, being able to see all these amazing places?
I think it's really interesting how you sort of view it, how I look back at that and how I have looked back at that at different times in my life. Certainly as a child, it felt very exotic, going, jetting off to all these places and seeing different sort of cultures. And there were times where it felt as if we were always on a sort of overseas holiday as opposed to going home. It felt very exciting because the army recognises the need for children to have a stable education. When serving members of the armed forces are overseas, we were at school in the UK, but we flew out to all these destinations for the holidays, and that felt very exciting. And I didn't realise that was relatively unusual lifestyle at the time. It seemed normal, but I think as I sort of became a sort of teenager and looking back, certainly from my early 20s, sometimes I felt that it can produce a bit of disconnect. You have your sort of home life in these fantastic locations, and one sort of school life, which can be quite sort of separate sometimes. I mean, overall, it suited me very well. I think it made me quite sort of independent, and I'm sure it shaped various things I've done in my life.
Oh, wow, absolutely fantastic. So what made you then want to go and join the military? Was it from growing up, was it your dad's influence? Or was it just the, this jet, I don't want to say jet setting lifestyle, but this traveling lifestyle that you had?
I think jet setting is probably the wrong word. Flying around in a 1970s DC-7 jet is with a sort of not the best packed lunch and a whole load of other school kids, probably as glamorous as I made it out to be. I think it's a combination of factors. Because my father was in the army, I guess I knew more about it. I was exposed to the reality of the job that involved. And I think that probably made it more likely that I would pursue a career in the army. But as well as that, I was dead set from a very early life that I wasn't going to work in an office. I enjoyed sport, and I enjoyed running around in the hills and the big outdoors, and camping in cold, wet places in Scotland was something which I always kind of took a bit of a shining to. And so I think the combination of those two things. And then also, as a sort of late teenager, I felt I really wanted to do something that's a service type job where you're actually doing something for perhaps sort of greater ideals or for society at large. And these sort of things came together, I think, quite naturally with wanting to join the army.
Oh, I mean, a great answer, really, a great answer. I just want to know then, I mean, we've spoken to, Rupert's told us, Scotty, our other ambassadors told us. How did you find it, joining the army? What was it like for you? Was it a big culture shock for you? How did you find it?
I think I think no matter how much one knows about it beforehand, there is a sort of culture shock, and you know, there is as with any job, there's a difference between what one has to do to go through the training and life actually living that job. I mean, that actually joining, you know, so I joined as an officer, and after university, I spent a year doing my military training at the Royal Military Academy, Sandhurst. And after I'll be entirely honest, relatively standard student life where I kind of wasn't the most industrious person, it is always a shock, you know, getting up at 6 o'clock every morning, having every hour taken up until at least midnight, being kept busy, running around, learning new skills. It is always a shock, no matter how much one knows about it. But certainly, what sort of makes that shock entirely sort of manageable and absorbable is the people that you're in that situation with. You know, mucking in with people. We've all coming from diverse backgrounds, all going through that similar sort of life change from our former life to joining the army. They are the biggest factor in managing that shock and getting through. And of course, you form lifelong friendships as a result.
Oh, brilliant! What made you want to go and join the Black Watch? And if you don't mind going and telling, I know Rupert spoke at episode 1 about what the Black Watch is. Do you mind just
I'm looking very nervous?
Do you just mind going and telling also our listeners, reminding them what the Black Watch is?
Okay, so certainly. So it is nothing to do with Game of Thrones, as some people have actually sort of suggested. It sounds like very sort of a glamorous medieval warrior type organization.
It really does.
So the Black is a regiment in the British Army. It's part of what's called the infantry. So that's what most people think of as soldiers doing. So essentially, that's the frontline part of the army that people naturally think of. Though of course, the army has every other sort of career opportunity to engineering, logistics, personnel support, all these sort of things. But the infantry is part of the combat branch of the army, and so that's what people most naturally think soldiers do. There are about 40 or so infantry regiments, and they all trace their historical lineage back to previous times. And the Black Watch was part of, or at the time was part of what's called the Scottish Division, which has now become the Royal Regiment of Scotland. And so the Black Watch traditionally, for over 250 years, have recruited from sort of southern central Scotland, areas around Perthshire, Angus, and Fife. And obviously, over the last couple of hundred years, took part in various campaigns and conflicts all around the world. The reason I joined them was I think my sort of family Scottish links, as it were. So my father had or served at the time in another Scottish regiment called the Gordon Highlanders. I was born in Inverness, up in the Highlands of Scotland, despite the fact that my accent doesn't really suggest that, and living in Scotland for quite a while, wanting to very much sort of be at the sort of at a sort of forefront, exciting part of the army. I was drawn towards the infantry, and so had a sort of Scottish heritage link into a Scottish regiment.
I mean, makes perfect sense, really. I think that's what I liked as well. I think, I like how, if you have a heritage from there, that's, one of the reasons. And it is obviously, as you went and, made that comment, it does sound very Game of Thronesy. There's the name, the Black Watch.
I mean, it is bizarre. I sort of, I sort of discussing with colleagues in my job as a doctor now, you talk about people, you naturally spend a lot of time talking about your colleagues' lives and what they've done, and somehow this sort of crops up in conversation, and then people immediately say, "Oh, that sounds like a sort of guard organization from the Game of Thrones." But in some, there's an element of truth to that, in that the Black Watch were formed in the 18th century to police or guard Scotland and the Highlands when there were sort of political and military wranglings there. So,
oh wow!
And hence watch, as in watch over, and black, where we call the black watch because the tartan is a very dark tartan. There's no red, there's no yellow in it. It's very dark blues and greens with blacks in it. So that's how they became known as the Black Watch.
Oh, brilliant! What was it like then being welcomed in and joining such a prestigious regiment? I'm assuming, I could see from Rupert's laughter, I'm assuming there was some level of hazing that was involved.
Well, I think it's. I actually loved it. Whilst at university in my early 20s, I went out and visited the regiment a couple of times for a month or so over the summer, and that took me to a large exercise in Canada, a military exercise in Canada in 1992. And then I visited the regiment when they were in Hong Kong in 93 and 94 for a month or so whilst at university. And so what that meant was I got to know people who would be my future colleagues. And I got such a warm welcome. The Black Watch prides itself on being a very family orientated regiment, and where everyone looks after each other and looks out for each other. And I just felt so very much at home there, I think, is perhaps one way of describing it. And I'm sure anyone from any other part of the British Army will describe a similar warmth of welcome.
Oh, well, Rupert, do you want to go and, talk about, same question to you, really, when you got into when you became part of the Black Watch?
Yeah, well, it's very similar, actually. I'd been out to visit them in Berlin, Germany. And they were just like-minded. I think most regiments, and certainly the Black Watch, you get interviewed for your suitability. So what they do in that interview is not so much, clearly you've got to be passing all your military stuff, but it's actually about whether you're a good family fit, whether you're going to mix in. So that sort of careful selection pays off. And I don't think there are ever any surprises. I can't think of any, Nick. Can you? Give people who went, oh, God, this isn't for me. We were just, there's another person a bit like me, really. We've got similar backgrounds. The friends network is similar. Some people have been to school together. In fact, it was one of the first questions one of my soldiers asked was, who did you go to school with? Not where, but who did you go to school with? And I went, well, they're a bit older than me, but Captain Coles, Captain Watson, and they went, yeah, come. And they got who I was as well. So it wasn't just to make sure the officers' mess was happy. It was about the whole regiment and the whole regiment having that family contact. Years ago, when we were really well recruited in the army, and I was at the depot, we used to do badging boards, a bit like Sandhurst, really. And these guys would come in and say, I want to join the Black Watch. And you'd go, that's great. Have you got any family in it? And they'd go, no. And I'd go, okay, what are the reasons? Go to the back of the queue. And, we'd have, say, 5 slots for the regiment. And if 4 of them had family connections, they got in. And then, it was the cream of the crop from the rest. And that meant there was cohesion from all the way from the youngest private soldier all the way through to the commanding officer. And that was great. And it made life really easy, I think, Nick, didn't it?
I'd agree with that totally, yeah. So it's about fitting in with people and, given not just when one is training and in barracks and leading a relatively sort of calm military life, but it's so that when we have to go and do the difficult things that the army does do, we know we can fit in, work with people, rely on them, trust them, and therefore be able to achieve collectively what it is we want to do. Absolutely.
Oh, so moving forward then, where was your first deployment to? Was it to Kosovo or was it to Northern Ireland? Where was it to?
That's right. So in the summer of 2001, we went to Kosovo for 6 months from Germany. So the Black Watch had moved to Germany about a year beforehand as part of sort of ongoing changeover of where British Army regiments serve. And so we went to Kosovo for 6 months in the tail end of 2001. And that was a couple of years after the operation had started in Kosovo. But so we were in Pristina, in the center of Kosovo. That was my first. Yeah.
What was that like then? Your first experience in a foreign country as well? Obviously, you've been traveling all over the world, throughout your entire life, but this is a different experience entirely. What was it like?
I think that's exactly right. In some ways, getting on a plane to another country somewhere connected to the army seemed very similar. But because I was doing it in a professional capacity and as an adult, as part of the British Army, it was also very, very different. In terms of the sort of the physical and the mental disruption to life, as in going from where we lived to another country, uprooted to a different pattern of life, I found that adjustment relatively easy, because in some ways I'd done that throughout my life. But it was a fascinating, I absolutely loved our time in Kosovo. It was the sixth, it was called, the British military operation was Operation Agricola in Kosovo. And it was the sixth iteration of that. And each tour generally lasts about 6 months. So the British Army had been in Kosovo for about 2.5 years by then. And it was a very, it was a benign environment, and it wasn't war fighting. Perhaps you could say it wasn't even peacekeeping, but it's more to do with supporting the Kosovo police, supporting relations between different, perhaps different ethnic groups and different organizations in Kosovo. And it was incredible. I mean, it was, catapulted from my life into the midst of an international, conflict is not the right word, but a matter that is at an international level around the world. So it was, I loved it. I had a fantastic time out there, and it was great to be, serving professionally in the British Army for the good of others around the world.
Yeah. So then after that, moving forward, you then went to Iraq. What year was that then?
That was 2003. So we flew to Kuwait in, it was the middle of February of 2003. And that was again from Germany. And that was part of the 7th Armoured Brigade, which was 4 regiments or so, which formed a larger part of the 1st UK Armoured Division, who were part of the coalition for Iraq in 2003. And we trained and prepared in Kuwait for a number of weeks. And then we crossed the border. I think it was the 22nd of March, 2003, into the British area, or what became the British area, around the towns of Basra and Azubaya, just 30 miles across from the Kuwaiti border.
Wow. What was that like? Because that is a completely different experience in every sense, you've gone from Europe into the Middle East, a completely different environment. Obviously, the army had been there previously in the first Iraq War. What was it like from your perspective being there for the second one?
That's a big question. I think one thing, it was so different in every way. I mean, physically, the environment was just so different, even in February. And obviously, the desert at night can be extremely cold at any time of year. But I remember there's one moment that I really remember really clearly. We got off the plane. We landed in Kuwait. Then we then got on a bus and were driven up north towards the northern areas of Kuwait, very close to the border with Iraq. And as the bus turned around the corner, the sun was coming up to the east, and we were just hit through the bus by this wave of heat. It was just like opening. It was like opening the oven door when your head's too close, and you just get that. And it was a very odd moment. It was just such intense heat, and so from very early on, there was this sort of physical aspect that was quite unusual, and it takes a long time to acclimatize to the heat. And I prefer a bit of cold weather suffering probably, and I like my cold mountains, and I prefer probably being sort of cold and wet and happy, even if I'm feeling slightly miserable. So I found the adaptation to the desert and the heat harder than I expected it. Definitely, it takes quite a while to adapt to that environment. But then I think, by contrast to what we'd experienced in Kosovo, there was so much uncertainty. Kosovo had been a relatively established and, as I said, quite a benign operation by then, whereas we had really individually and collectively no idea what was going to happen. We knew what we were going to be doing, but the outcome was, uncertain. And in some ways, life becomes very simple. And what I mean by that is not what we had to do was simple at all, but everyday concerns about mortgage and home and when the car insurance is and these kind of things just get pared away, and life becomes very simple in terms of looking after the people you're with and making sure they're okay, doing whatever we had to do, eating, sleeping and drinking, and life becomes very sort of caveman, sort of pared down human existence in some ways. So overall, I mean, it was a massive experience in so many different ways.
So, I mean, that sounds, were you aware at the time of how big, this was around the world? The kind of you spoke about, being in Kosovo, but this, the whole eyes of the world were on you at this moment. Were you all aware of that?
Yes, we were. Yeah, I mean, it had been building up in the international community for some time. It became increasingly obvious that the British Army was probably heading towards that part of the world, and yeah, we were very conscious of, whilst we had to prepare, do all sorts of things to prepare for what we were going to be asked to do, and whilst we didn't necessarily have a huge amount of contact with what was going on in the press around the world, very much that sense that this was a significant history-altering period of time that was about to unfold, and despite life being very simple in the way I described, we were also very much, very aware of that. Yeah.
How long were you in Iraq for then? Was it one tour, two tours?
So my first tour ended. I think I flew out to Iraq I think it was early in July 2003. So for about 5 months, and that was mainly around Basra and the southern zone. And then the Blackwatch went back to Iraq just over a year later, for another 6 months, from about July to December of 2004.
How different were those two tours then? For how much of a change was there in that year-long time?
There was a significant change, very significant change. I think when we went back to be around Basra the second time, 2004, things were a lot hairier. I remember being able to, when I left Iraq in 2003, most parts, or about 80% of Basra, I would happily drive around in a Land Rover with a couple of other people, maybe with one other vehicle, because it was safe enough to do that. Things had changed within a year, and it was more dangerous. There were more fatalities, and it was harder to move around. It would require going in larger formations of people with armored vehicles and things. So it had changed quite significantly.
Yeah. So was that so you did 2 tours of Iraq then, and then did you then decide to go and leave the military? Was that a catalyst for going and leaving, or was did you just know when you want to leave, you just thought this is a good time?
I think several things sort of came together at the sort of right time, and I absolutely loved my time in the regular army. I sort of had this sense that I was perhaps going to take a different track in life at some stage. I always wanted to leave the regular army happy. I think the worst thing anyone can do in any organization is want to leave but not leave and hang around, and people can become a little bit counterproductive, I think, and I didn't want to be a bad smell. I wanted to leave at a time when I felt I'd had some very rich experiences from the army and felt good about what I'd done. And I'd had a sort of slightly weird idea in the back of my head for a number of years that maybe I wanted to be a doctor. And it was weird because I'm not scientific. I gave up chemistry and biology and things when I was 16 at school, and I was very happy in the army, and I loved it. And it seemed a long shot to convince myself to go and do something so different when I was loving doing what I was doing in the army. But after operations in Kosovo and Iraq, I felt that I'd been part of something big and important around the world, and I felt personally that I'd got a lot out of that, and I could leave happily and take a different career track.
I mean, what was it like leaving? Because I ask this question to every guest, and everyone says, the change onto Civvy Street is a big one. Yep. How did you find that adjustment?
It is huge. It is always huge, and it's always huge, and it can affect people in ways they don't expect, and it can affect people in times they don't expect. I left with a real sense of purpose in that I'd applied to medical. I'd got into medical school in Scotland. I knew where I was going. I knew that I was committing myself to a significant amount of study, a lifestyle change in terms of, going from having a professional salary to a reduced salary. So it was mixed. I had a sense of purpose, and I enjoyed my time at medical school, but I found life very difficult for a couple of years, actually, extremely difficult. And I think a lot of people do. And my difficulties were around, I think, my sort of sense of identity. And then so I started at medical school when I was 33. I wasn't the oldest on the course, but I was one of the older people, and and I found it the word I use is unhinging. I found it unusual going from being of a certain position in the army with a certain sort of status in a large organization and a certain clearly defined role, and to going back to being a student at a time in my life where I was, I saw myself as a professional person. That's quite a sort of dislocating sort of identity, really. And things were very, very difficult actually for a couple of years. And I hadn't expected it. I thought this is going to be plain sailing. I've worked out where I'm going into a new career. It'll just be fine. And I think perhaps a lot of people have similar experiences with that. It catches up on you in different ways.
Well, I mean, this kind of leads on well to my next question: is what advice would you give anyone who has made that switch onto Civvy Street?
I would say to sort of focus on the deeper issues and not necessarily the obvious issues. And perhaps what I mean by that is, any transition from the military to another working life into another life, there's going to be a professional adjustment. We're probably all going to take a loss in salary for a certain amount of time. And those are the things people naturally think of. And they're right to think about that. We have to think about how that's going to impact on our families and various things. But actually, people can often become established in whatever career they go into. But you can't anticipate when it's going to hit you and how it does. But I think looking back, I wish people had advised me to, really consider how I would deal with things if things became very difficult. And in some ways, that's a very difficult question to answer because you don't know what the difficulties are going to be, and you don't know how you're going to react to them. But it ties in with what Rupert was saying. I think about the family support that we all derive from each other in the military helps us. It cushions us from certain difficulties, and it helps us deal with certain difficulties. And then when people are suddenly catapulted into the rest of the world and into a more normal life, you can feel quite alone, and you can feel despite a strong network. So I think, it's a balance between not dwelling excessively on bad things or difficulties that might happen, but certainly, bracing oneself and thinking about how one can establish a similar support network, but different from to deal with the unexpected.
Yeah. Oh, fantastic. Absolutely brilliant. So Nick, what was it like then going from Iraq to then becoming a doctor? Massive shift. What was it like for you? How did you find it?
I was 39, nearly 40 when I qualified from medical school, and I was just relieved to get to the end of medical school. I would.
How long is medical school? Sorry, how long is it?
That's a good question. It should have been 5 years for me. I had a couple of bad years in my life. I failed some exams, and I was asked to resit a year as a result. So I joke now. I loved it so much that I extended it to 6 years. The reality is, it was extended in my best interests. I took me 6 years to get through medical school, and so I was 39 by the time I started as a junior doctor. What I found difficult was being a 39-year-old with, albeit a very different life experience, but I was, used to working hard, making quite complex and then not dangerous decisions, but decisions where there is risk involved. And I found the sort of early life as a junior doctor quite challenging, I think, in that starting again at the very bottom of a professional pile, age 39, just from a personal angle is unusual. And the NHS needs a lot of junior doctors who can manage patients on wards and do all sorts of things, where perhaps early on they're not so much directing the course of things, but following the direction from senior consultants and things, and that's absolutely appropriate. And being 39 at the time, I felt I was often sort of itching to progress to a more grade and more senior role.
So that sounds incredibly hard. Was any of that resilience that you learned, were you in the military? Were you able to apply that to your current situation?
Yeah, definitely it helped. I mean, I think if I'd gone to medical school, when I was 18, and if I'd started as a 22-year-old, I would have found the sort of the responsibility and the hours and the relentless pace of being a junior doctor. I would probably find that quite challenging. Now, that's not to say it wasn't in the army, but it was just overall a slightly different situation. I think I'm very happy working hard. I mean, people who know me well would probably suggest that if I'm not kept busy and not occupied, I can become a bit of a nightmare. So it was, but I think, it was junior doctors do work immensely hard. There's no doubt about that. The sort of horror stories of 120-hour weeks are no longer the case, but it can be a very relentless job in terms of long hours in hospital. And there's an aspect which I think people aren't so much aware of. There's a relentless toll on oneself when one is doing so much to help others and get them through a difficult time that is emotionally very draining as well. And whilst it was a very different environment from being in the military, in some ways it was the same, cognitively and emotionally, it was the same thing, I think, in terms of I felt comfortable in that sort of slightly uncomfortable environment, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
I felt comfortable with the weight of the decisions, and I felt comfortable. I wouldn't say I enjoyed it, but I felt comfortable being exhausted a lot of the time because I experienced that in the army.
So, yeah, I mean, I can completely understand what you're saying in terms of these similarities. The work hours. In my mind, the military, being in the military and being a doctor, two of the most stressful jobs. I mean, you picked two of the most stressful jobs.
No, that's fine. I don't have much hair on top of my head anymore, I think. Yeah.
Obviously, it's been this past year has been a massive shock all around the world with the ongoing coronavirus pandemic. What has it been like for you You know, Rupert said it beforehand. You went from one front line to another. What was that? What was that like?
Gosh.
Yeah, sorry about that. I've said a really big question. I'm so sorry.
Trying to organize, I have so many thoughts on this, and I need to try and sort of organize them into some sort of sense. I think, you know, in some ways, it was a similar situation for me. So I've chosen to work in accident and emergency. That's where I feel I fit in the NHS and where I feel my skill set is. And accident and emergency was very much sort of the front line, as were our partners in acute, what we call acute medicine, in hospitals, very much part of it. In some ways, part of me, when we could see things beginning to change in the NHS and in the hospital, part of me was, this is exactly the same as going to Iraq. And now, in some ways, totally different, but in terms of it being obvious that a new significant period of life was going to come upon us, be forced upon us, when it was very sort of unknown how it was going to be, very unknown exactly how severe it was going to be, with a completely unknown duration. So in some ways, again, I felt comfortable in this sort of uncomfortable feeling of it. But it, you know, the flip side is, we knew that as long as we came back from Iraq alive, we would be there for 5-6 months at a time. We're over a year into this. We still don't know how long it's going to be with us. And so in some ways, whilst the risk to us individually is significantly less than it was in, you know, overseas in Iraq and things, there is this, you can see a mental effect from colleagues in terms of, and myself in terms of, long-term fatigue and the sense that we just don't know how long this is going to be with us. Yeah. Probably forever.
Yeah. What was it like at the start? Did you know, there was this outpour of what was that like?
It was an incredible feeling to feel valued and supported in that way by people around the country. And the reality, there's an unusual reality that of working in A&E. I think we'll be surprised how often we're not thanked, and we don't do it to be thanked. But I think people will be surprised how often we are treated quite rudely and in not the nicest manner by people. That's just part and parcel, unfortunately, of A&E life from time to time. So it was incredible to feel and we did all sort of feel the nation's sort of support behind us. But it was odd in the hospital. We simply didn't know how many patients we were going to have who were going to be extremely unwell. There was a certain amount of, we didn't know how easily the virus was transmitted, how dangerous it would be. We all had this sense that we were probably all going to get, you know, through our work, we were going to be exposed to COVID. So there's lots of levels at which it throws in uncertainty, and it's relentless sort of wearing down by it, perhaps is a way to describe it.
You don't have to answer this next one, even. But did you ever get COVID from it all? Just being constantly exposed to the virus.
I'm certain I've had COVID. I came unwell with sort of textbooks or symptoms of it and things. We are exposed in A&E. We were certainly in spring of last year and summer, and I guess into the autumn of last year, we had lots of patients who we dealt with on a one-to-one basis who we actually know, did have the virus. But the hospital and the NHS are very sort of sensible about this in terms of wanting to protect the workforce and test people and make sure everyone's okay. I guess earlier on we were all very concerned. Well, we all knew we were going to be exposed to it, and no one knew what the death rates would be and things. And so there was that sense of trepidation. But yeah, I mean, I'm still exposed to it from time to time at work.
Yeah,
I'm sure I've.
Wow. Did any? I mean, it is also kind of, I don't know if this is a silly question, but did any of your training, once again, did that come into effect at all? Did we able to transfer those military skills into this last year? You know, I mean, because this last year, it's like you said, hasn't been like anything else. I mean, it's been completely different. It's just been a completely new experience for the entire world.
I think there were some very sort of similarities in that, we spent, Rupert will remember these sort of, we trained in the army for what was called nuclear, biological and chemical warfare. It's changed name, but people think of gas masks and the protective suits and things. And I remember having this wry moment where we were being sort of trained up to use, the new visors, the new gowns, and all this kind of thing. And I was just chuckling. It's like, it reminded me of preparing and practicing these sort of things in the desert, in Iraq. It's interesting trying to sort of. I've recently had my appraisal at work for how I've got on over the last year, and one of the things that cropped up there was what sort of place I give COVID in my life over the last year, and I tried to sort of, or the way I think of it, I don't want to give COVID more place than it deserves in my life, but I recognise that it's there, and I think we all, to different extent, had different sort of coping mechanisms and different ways of becoming comfortable with it. And they're absolutely, in some ways, it seems entirely the same as being in Iraq in a difficult situation. Physically, it's different. The risks are different, but it's the internal feeling is the same.
Yeah. Rupert, I don't know whether you had any questions.
No, I mean, it's interesting that the similarities are there, but I imagine you talked about the emotional stress of it all. In the military, your training takes you through a number of procedures and exercises and so on, and puts you in an increasingly difficult situation, which sort of prepares you for it. And the whole nation, not just the NHS, but everybody was unprepared really for COVID, and therefore a lot of people weren't ready, weren't trained, not necessarily in the NHS, to cope with this separation from friends and so on. You see it, every time there's a little chink, you can have two people outdoors, everybody just hurtles around. And it's that, what I find extraordinary about it is, in some ways, it is clearly taking a big emotional toll on some parts of society. It must be taking an emotional toll on the NHS, because they're dealing with it every day and going home to their families at night. And that must be different for you, Nick. You've done all the operations, isolated from your family, and then going back to it later, clean, if you see what I mean, rather than what you must be doing now is you're going home to your family and you're trying to deal it emotionally in a family environment, as opposed to a military family environment. You see what I mean?
It's a very different thing. And when sort of last March, I'd had a week's leave and I was going back into the hospital, really starting up. And I had a long chat with my wife about how we're sort of managed. We just didn't know what the risk was going to be and how we'd manage it. And Kat grew up in Zimbabwe in sort of civil war and things in the late 70s. So she has quite a sort of very sort of sensible view about risk and how you manage it and things. And I actually moved into hospital accommodation for the first few weeks or so, just so that I could, just because we didn't know how dangerous it was going to be, it made sense for me to try and reduce the risk to my family by living in hospital, simple accommodation, and being removed from home for a bit. But you're absolutely right. It's hard sort of flip-flopping between being exposed to it on a work basis, and actually I'm glad I've been able to go to work. I'm glad I've been able to get, work gets me into another environment, gets me into a large group of people who I get on with. I think if I'd been in a different job and stuck at home, I would have found it very, very difficult. But there are times, there's certainly times where the relentless toll of it it has an impact on my life. There have been times where I've been quite sort of sullen, probably quite grumpy. Some would say that's normal for me. I'm more than normal. It does have an impact, absolutely, on one's home life, and it's a very sort of intense, distilled version of the personal difficulties of working in healthcare and how much it takes out of you.
Oh, yeah. Wow. I think Rupert's question there has led on quite nicely to my other questions, because as a military family charity, we understand the importance of family, and we just wanted to know, ask you a few questions, about, we wanted to know what your favorite family holiday was, because I think, it's, I think we'll try and end it on a more positive note.
Okay, so do you mean when I grew up as a child?
You know what? It can be, because you've had such an interesting childhood, I'm actually going to ask it twice. Once when you were a child and once recently. Yeah.
Okay. So we one of the holidays I remember most vividly from my childhood was we were living in Germany, as I said, sort of Western Germany in the early 80s when the Cold War was still going on, and we went to Switzerland for a summer holiday for about 2 weeks, and we flat in a town just outside Geneva. It was beautiful summer weather, and we went walking, and it was not we drove down, we piled into the car, me and my brothers and my parents, in a sort of hot 8-hour drive through continental Europe. We arrived there. There was a lot of sibling rivalry in the car. We all arrived all quite fed up with each other, and I had a broken arm at the time, and one of these sort of things that passes into family folklore, that we arrived, we had to load the car and get everything into the flat, and I sort of cradled in my sort of broken arm this large pot of Marmite, and as I went up the stairs, it inevitably dropped it, and it caused a huge sort of family scene. However, we had a lovely family holiday. We didn't fall out. It's that's sort of seared inexorably in my mind. Getting away and enjoying the fresh air of the Swiss Alps and was fantastic. And perhaps sort of more recently, we actually went on a skiing holiday in January of last year, shortly before COVID, and to the French Alps. And we'd been very busy for a number of years and hadn't been able to go on holiday for a number of years, and we just had the most fantastic time. And it was the biggest sort of contrast to come back and suddenly being sort of struck by the COVID pandemic. So for me, both involved in the Alps, that's my cold, wet comfort zone. But,
I mean, how important was that? Because being so busy, we see this all the time with families coming to us who are just so busy. How important was it just having that time then, when you are so busy, just have that week away? And I mean, how important was it for you? Because I imagine A&E is so stressful, so intense.
It's A&E's an interesting job. I mean, it's it's not all as intense as maybe in TV shows and things. Or, the variety and the unpredictability are the things that stand out for me. There is no such thing as a typical day, but over a typical period of time, we'll deal with everything from lots of broken ankles to lots of people who are having heart attacks or strokes and everything in between. It's really important to get sort of downtime from a job like that. And I find it quite often takes a good few days to unwind if I've had a sort of long run of shifts. And the other aspect of it is A&E is open 24 hours a day, so it's impossible to get into a sleep routine with shifts. My shifts are to, I think, 10 or 11 different times throughout. So it can be quite settling. And actually just having a week where I knew when I was going to bed and when I was getting up and what I was going to be doing, and just enjoying the fresh air and the exercise was just perfect. I was probably getting a bit grouchy in January of last year, because A&E is pretty busy over December and Christmas, and it was just the perfect sort of fresh air, get some exercise, eat lots of cheese, and have some wine. Yeah.
Well, I've only got one question left because I don't want to, because we are approaching the hour. I did, can you spare like 5-6 more minutes, or do you need to go?
No, please do.
Oh, brilliant. Well, before I ask my final question, I was going to give it back to Rupert, whether he had any questions or anything he was wanted to add before I ask my lovely final question?
No, I think the only thing is extraordinary, bold decision. It's a bold switch, I think we used to call it, didn't we? Into a new career. Do you look back and go, maybe I should have stayed, or you're happy with the choice? Difficult one.
Where do I feel I fit in? I still feel I'm an army officer more than I feel I'm a doctor. So I've been working as a doctor just under 9 years now. I stayed on. When I left the regular army, I joined the Army Reserves, and I stayed on in that for a few years until recently. And so I didn't totally give up being in the army whilst I was at university, at medical school, and beyond. It's still. I often have this sense that I'm a misfit in medicine, in that most of my colleagues who are doctors went into it when they were straight from school, straight from university at the junior age, and I think it whilst I enjoy, I love what I do there. I just personally, I kind of still, if I was to say, what am I? How do I feel about myself? It's an army officer rather than a doctor. It's an interesting sort of balance. It's quite hard to sort of explain the sort of how it makes me feel about it. But would I had a fantastic time in the army. I'm glad I didn't become a doctor straight from when I was 22. I'd have missed out on some amazing times in the army, and it would not have been the right time for me to do it. I think I came into it in the right time of my life. I came into medicine at a very complicated time in my life, not straightforward. Yes, it's a mixed answer, that one, really, I think.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's fascinating because, you and I have known each other really since the Hong Kong visit, I think.
Yeah.
And, charging around the other side of the world. And then I missed out on Iraq because I was getting too old. And, extraordinary, unbeknown to everyone here, sort of quick chat beforehand. Actually, it could have been yesterday that we saw it, which is great, really great. So no, other than to thank you, Nick, for putting yourself in the spot. Extraordinary tale.
Thank you, Rupert. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you.
Oh, well, all I have is one last question for you, Nick. It's a lovely question. We ask all our guests this, and it is, what does family mean to you?
What does family mean to me? I would not be able to do any of the things that I've done in my life, in the military or in medicine, without the most incredible family support at home. And, from an early age, moving around the world, being part of this incredibly warm family where we'd go off and do exciting things, and I'd fall out with my brothers and pick up the people in my relationship with my brothers. To be able to, we'll have the most fantastic home life here in Scotland. The internet is pretty terrible. We're caught in a valley. It's semi-rural. It's about 4 miles off the main road. We have a very peaceful existence here. And so I live here with Kat and her daughter, Sasha. And I've got 3 other children who come here. And, we have the most fantastic, calming family time in the midst of changing challenges around the world.
Oh, brilliant. Well, I mean, this has been a fantastic podcast. I've really enjoyed this. So interesting. And I think, I can speak for everyone when I say thank you so much for everything that you've been doing over this past year, for the whole British public. Thank you so much. Because, you guys have been on the front line. We've just been indoors. So thank you so much for everything that you've done, Nick. Thank you.
That's very kind of you to say. Thank you.
And I just want to say thank you to everyone for listening to episode 16 of the Give Us Time podcast. Please make sure to like and subscribe to the Give Us Time channels. Share this as well. And thank you everyone so much for listening. And we'll be back next time with former Royal Marine Mark Ormond. So we'll be interviewing Mark. He is a triple amputee. So we'll be talking about his time, his recovery, him leaving the military, and how he's gone on to raise hundreds of thousands of pounds for charity. So make sure you follow us so you don't miss out on that next podcast. Thank you everyone for listening, and have a lovely day. Bye-bye.